Talking about some of the devastation in parts there in central Texas. San Angelo is where that woman was located, and some of those videos are hard to imagine what it was looking like, what it felt like to be there with so much water inside of their homes. Let's continue to talk about what's going on in Kerr County. As this morning, more watches and warnings were issued. You can see the live radar now, courtesy of our X-Rad monitor. And it looks like the storms have moved over toward eastern Texas. But earlier on today, another potentially amount of rainfall, precipitation. This from MyRadar weather saying 2 weeks, 2 massive floods in Texas. The flooding last week, the top point of that chart on the left, and then today's flooding. So almost the same amount in 2 straight weeks, 2 straight weekends. Let's continue on and bring in right now senior meteorologist with MyRadar weather, Matthew Cappucci, friend of the program. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Looking at that chart, it is difficult to see that this is round number 2. How do you interpret that? How do you view it? How do you explain it?
You know, this morning, another 1.5 trillion gallons worth of water came down. For perspective, that's enough to fill tens of thousands of Olympic-sized swimming pools, and unfortunately, this was enough to cause significant flooding on area rivers, including the Lampasas, San Saba, the Llano, and the Guadalupe River. The Guadalupe River was the one that flooded last week, and we're seeing enormous jumps in rivers once again. Now, I want to take you to the town of Kempner, which is just west of Killeen, Texas. They saw a 30-foot spike in water levels this morning along the river right there, that, of course, being the Lampasas River. And it was to the point where they had a 55,000% increase in water flow rate through that river, meaning every 1.3 seconds, enough water was flowing by to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Some places last night saw 8 to 10 inches worth of water, and the rain is finally beginning to wane now, but that flood watch carries through tonight because additional rounds of water are possible. There you see that photo of that video right there, showing the water just rushing through. A lot of these are small streams, mostly dry riverbeds that only are a trickle, and then suddenly whenever it rains, because the watersheds are so large, you can have an enormous area of water that drains into only a couple of rivers, and that's why you might get a 100-fold plus increase in flow rate.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about because those percentages don't seem real at all. And you mentioned some of what's coming up, and I do want to put up just this post from Brooke Taylor, Fox News team there on the ground, saying some relief tonight for families with missing loved ones as rescue teams are allowed to resume those search efforts in West Kerr County. The sheriff's office said a flood watch issued by the National Weather Service remains in effect until 7 p.m., so about 90 minutes or so from now. We talk about this and just the kind of recipe for all of this water, and now it's sunny in that region. Is there potentially more precipitation on the way? What do we look at when we look at the forecast?
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks have been caught off guard by these quickly evolving forecasts. And part of the reason for that is because we don't have any big, large-scale triggering mechanisms. We didn't last week. We don't have any big fronts or anything like that this week. There's no warm front, no cold front, no big pressure systems nearby. So what's happening is you have a lot of what are called mesoscale features, these smaller scale weather features that are tougher to see more than 6 to 12 hours out on weather models. In both last week's event and this week's event, we had something called a mesoscale convective vortex, basically a little leftover swirl in the atmosphere left by since disintegrated storms. Last night we had storms over New Mexico that left a little swirl that went through the night, and this morning that caused more storms over central Texas. And what happens is each of these so-called MCVs does 2 things. Number 1, it entrains moisture. It's like a tug that pulls in a fire hose of moisture from the Gulf and from the south. And the other thing it does too is focus storms. It's like a little focal mechanism, a little local trigger. And once the storm goes up, there's nothing to really scoot it along. The jet stream has retreated well north into Canada. And so when you factor that all together, you have tough to predict storms that pop up somewhere. Once they're up, there's nothing to really cause them to collapse until later the next day. So they rage through the night. They might produce rainfall rates of 2 to 3 plus inches per hour. And there's nothing to really stop that. And so I think tonight we have potentially a similar environment. I don't see quite as much moisture in the atmosphere, and I don't see quite as much of a little trigger. You know, one thing I'll point out that was a saving grace this time was that the atmosphere was about 10 to 20% less humid. We still had a very juiced up air mass, but it wasn't quite as juicy as last week's. And I think that made a little bit of a difference in preventing as many double digit rainfall totals. I will point out, though, that we had at least one weather station near San Saba that was up to 9.44 inches worth of rain in just 1 hour's time this morning between 3:40 a.m. and 4:40. They got 3.71 inches. That is a month's worth of rain in 1 hour's time, showing you how heavy these downpours were. And so, when you have an hour or 2, 3 hours underneath something like that, it's no surprise you're getting flooding.
Yeah, there's nowhere for that water to go. And when it comes down at that rate, it's hard to kind of see it happen. I do want to ask you, and this might be a difficult question to simplify, but you talk about that kind of whirlpool effect, the tug, the MCVs. Why are they so difficult to predict?
That's a really good question, and I'm actually quite pleased you asked that question. I think the reason they're tough to predict is because in this sort of summer weather pattern, you have these large-scale thunderstorm complexes that will blossom. And, we know somewhere this complex will happen, but they start to wander. And then when a thunderstorm complex dies, both ends of it kind of pinch off. One end sort of fizzles, but the other end kind of sticks around as that so-called MCV. And that MCV, that little leftover swirl, is very analogous to when you're rowing a boat, you're rowing a canoe, and you have those two little whirlpools that shed off the oar. And they just kind of meander wherever they want to go. And there's no real rhyme or reason as to where they go and which direction they'll move. And so that's one part of it, the fact that they're just sort of very capricious. They do their own thing. And the other tricky element is that because they're small scale, only 10 to 20 miles wide, they're not to the scale that our long-range weather models can see. Our long-range weather models might have grid boxes on the order of 50 to 100 miles across, and so they don't really resolve things this small. Our shorter-range weather models can sometimes capture these, but because they're finer and more detailed, they don't go out quite as far into the future. And so it's one of those situations where until you're about 6 to 12 hours out, you can't necessarily see where these small-scale features like the mesoscale convective vortex, that MCV you mentioned, will evolve, where they'll go, and to what extent they'll be able to produce thunderstorms. And so tonight, for example, I'm still unsure about my forecast for tonight. I do think we'll have a lesser flood risk tonight. I think East Texas may see some flooding from that remnant storm complex moving through. I don't see as much propensity for an MCV to evolve into the overnight hours. And I think at least we've wrung some of the moisture out of the air. One small blessing with these downpours, once you pull the moisture out of the air, it takes a day or two for the atmosphere to essentially recover and get moisture back up. So I think the flood threat is waning today.
Yeah, and that's why the unpredictability of some of these storms could lead to the deadly outcomes. We see it with this, but also tornadoes are very difficult to predict, and they can be deadly as well. I want to ask you about watches and warnings because we talk about the flash floods in terms of watches and warnings this morning. Are they more susceptible to issue those knowing what we had in the past? Is a National Weather Service in Central Texas more likely to try to get people out early? Is there concern with that?
Yeah, so one thing that I'll say is that we have this essentially a product in the computer that's called flash flood guidance. It takes into account how much rain has fallen recently and the permeability of soils, of materials, and it takes all these things into consideration, and it spits out a number, and it might say, in this region, in this box on the map, you might need 2 inches in 1 hour to cause flash flooding. You might need 6 inches in 3 hours to cause flash flooding. It will give you essentially for every different region you're forecasting for a threshold at which point you would expect flash flooding to begin. Now, of course, when we had 3 to 4 inch per hour rainfall rates last night, we certainly overwhelmed that regardless of where we are. But the complicating factor is that soil moisture is so high. The ground is like a sponge, and once it's saturated, any additional water is going to go straight to runoff and enter the creeks, enter the streams, and potentially back up and cause flooding. And so that's been a factor. The other factor, too, you still have people out and about conducting rescue and more likely recovery missions. We have 170 people who are still unaccounted for, many of whom are presumably deceased along the Guadalupe River. It's a tragic situation, but there are still crews going out and essentially combing through wreckage and combing through hard-hit, beleaguered areas, trying to find potential victims. I know the Texas Parks and Game Office has found, I believe, 44 victims so far. And they're one of many different state departments working this effort. When you have more flooding pouring into areas where rescue personnel are, that's adding a whole additional layer of complexity to the situation. And so in this case, the National Weather Service, of course, did a great job issuing warnings with plenty of advance notice. And fortunately, rescuers were able to get out of Dodge. But it just goes to show you, oftentimes with these disasters, the response has to be multifaceted. And we're not immune to the weather even after it happens.
Yeah, lots of layers to it. And also they mentioned the fact that this new round of rain, they'll have to recomb through areas that they already went through due to the debris movement and whatnot with those rivers. My last question, Matthew, before I let you go, because we talk about how these MCVs, we saw the amount of rain last week and the amount of rain this weekend. What would it take? What would need to happen in the atmosphere to break this cycle, to kind of tone down the atmosphere, the weather in that region?
Honestly, we just need a cold front, and a cold front will be both a blessing and a curse. We need something to scour out the atmosphere. We literally need northwest flow to shove the moisture down to the Gulf of Mexico where it came from. And I don't necessarily see any large-scale cold fronts coming in. Today, we've cleared out the atmosphere. The atmosphere was like a washcloth. We wrung it out, and it's dried out a little bit. But really, we need a larger scale pattern change, and that would come from high pressure in the western U.S. and low pressure in the eastern U.S., inducing northwest flow to essentially shove the moisture away. And until we get that, it's going to be hard-pressed to really bring an end into the flooding.
All right, very good. Matthew, anything else you'd like to add? I know we got into some complicated, complex subjects, but anything else you'd like to add before I let you go?
I think the biggest thing for me is just making sure folks have a plan. And I know I've said this before, and I know that it sounds cliche to emphasize having a plan, but realistically, no matter what part of the country, everybody should know what hazards they face and what they would do. It's like if you send your kid to school, you know that child is going to have a fire drill and know what to do if there's a fire. You want to make sure that as a family, you're talking with your children, your loved ones, your neighbors, your elderly folks, anybody, what you're going to do if there's a tornado, if there's a hurricane, if there's a flood, if there's an earthquake. If you live in California, odds are you have an earthquake plan. If you live in Florida, you probably have a hurricane plan. If you live in Texas, you need a tornado plan, and you especially need a flood plan. And I think culturally, when we talk about tornado warnings, the expectation is when you get a tornado warning, something is imminent or occurring, and it happens within 12 minutes on average. I think when it comes to flood warnings and flash flood warnings, we're a little bit more complacent and we're conditioned to not act as quickly. And I think what happened last week at Camp Mystic is evidence that when you get a warning on your phone, you need to take immediate action. And you cannot base your actions off what you've experienced before. Because if you've survived before, that survivor's bias, that doesn't mean you're guaranteed a positive outcome next time, and you do have to get yourself out of harm's way.
Yeah, it cannot be reiterated enough to make sure you have a plan in case some of these natural disasters, no matter where you live, happen, because they can happen at a moment's notice. Matthew Cappucci, thank you so much. I appreciate your insight, as always, here on Live Now.
Andy, always a pleasure. Thanks.
All right, take care. All right, thanks again. All right, great conversation there. As always, making sure everyone has a plan for when those flash floods potentially coming your way. We saw it last weekend with the deadly flooding there in central Texas. The amount of rainfall, again, very staggering, as some of these images you heard there from Matthew Cappucci talking about just having 9 inches of rainfall in a singular hour. That is difficult to understand and comprehend, and the wall of water that moves down some of these waterways, these corridors to a more larger scale is very difficult to predict, but it's also very dangerous for the region. I also want to put up just this one as we go to break, the showcase of how much water fell last week versus this week, and it is similar in magnitude in terms of the height as 2 weeks, 2 massive floods in Texas. I'm Andy Mack. We're back after this.